Friends of Jesus Christ, be careful then how you live. Now, the Apostle Paul is calling us to being careful, in part because of what he has said in the previous parts of his letter, namely that you and I have a new identity. And in a way, we have to be careful with it. Because we are a people who are no longer driven by our darker desires, greed and lust and envy. But Paul says we are to be imitators of God, as beloved children. Love one another as Christ has loved us. And then this is in this chapter 5, he goes on to say, we are no longer in darkness. We're not only in the light, we are light, he says. And the fruit of light, and I really like this, the fruit of light is to be found in all that is good and right and true. Then he continues, and I sort of regret not putting it in the readings, but he says then, sleep or awake, arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. And the commentators that I've read suggest that may well have been something said at baptisms. And that in the baptism, Christ's light shines on us. And we become a transformed people. We are like the transformation from a caterpillar to a butterfly. We are transformed from a people who walk in darkness, and we live in the light. And by living in the light, we are alive to God's glory. Not only are we alive to God's glory, we know ourselves to be enveloped by that glory. And so that once in a while you are out there, or you're in a group of people, and everything speaks to you of God's glory. I remember one person being walking in the woods, and things were just so lovely that he felt like kneeling, and he said he dared not look into the face of the sky because he knew it was but a veil before the face of God. To be as a people, Paul says, we are light and we are alive to the glory of God. And so we're to be careful. Now, this being careful, I think, the image that came to my mind is a runner who wants to take a shortcut through a dog park that's not been cared for very carefully. And he's got the new runner shoes, expensive ones. And so he knows any misstep, he would regret it. And so he would be careful as he walked through the dog park. We're to be careful, Paul says. Careful then how you live. Don't be clueless about where you should be or how you should behave or what you should say. Be careful. And then he says, be wise. Not unwise, but wise. Foolish, but wise. And I'm thinking the lectionary at this point thought Proverbs was the perfect complement. For in Proverbs, the simple and the immature are called by wisdom to sit at her table and be fed so that she might live with insight and know what God's will is. So we're to be wise. Proverbs, of course, says very famously in that same chapter that the beginning of wisdom is fear of God. And fear of God not as being frightened of God or fleeing from God, but fearful in the sense of a deep respect, a holy reverence, not wanting to slight God or act contemptuous towards him, but a holy reverence. And this holy reverence of God is not simply this relationship that you and I have with God, but it then becomes the framework in which we live, so that we're always seeing things and seeing ourselves in a God-related situation. It's always God-related. I remember, this is back in Exeter, so this is a long time ago, but I would tell children talk. I would have children talks. And one very small, short story, really, but it has always stuck with me. It was about a city girl going to visit her cousin who lived in the country. And she's, say, 5, 6 years old, and she was very excited about going to seeing her cousin in the country. And when she was there, they went for a walk into a field that was just ablaze with flowers. And she was just astonished at all the flowers. And the country cousin said to her, "Well, pick some." And then she looked at him with wide opened eyes and says, "But aren't they God's?" Now, it's a children's story, but I've thought about that, and I thought, that is to see things God-related. And my forebears, the Dutch, who brought the Africans to serve as slaves in the United States, if they had said, "But aren't they God's?" The way we treat our bodies, the way we treat our earth, to ask ourselves, to have the wisdom to ask ourselves, but this does belong to God. And therefore, it should be treated as something or someone who belongs to God. So Paul says, be careful. Don't be unwise. Be wise. See all things in a God-related way. And then he says, make the most of the time because the days are evil. Now, making the most of the time. In Greek, they have two words for time: chronos, which is measured in minutes, and kairos, which is measured in opportunities, right? Now, here, it's not chronos, and so to take, if it were chronos, you take out your calendar book, and you would make very sure that you had every little square filled with some activity, making the most of your time, making the most of it. But that's not at all what Paul is saying. He's saying make the most of the opportunity, and the opportunity, it's not just this opportunity or that opportunity. In some ways, the whole of our life is an opportunity. In fact, I remember Peter Kraft saying once that the earth is not separate from heaven, it is heaven's womb. It is heaven's workshop. And so the earth is our opportunity to become Christ-like, so that all that happens to us, the difficult parts and the easy parts, the wonderful times and the hard times, they're there to help us be shaped into Christ-like people. To take the most of the time. When I was thinking about these things for this sermon, and I was thinking about this initial thing about being alive to the glory of God and experiencing awe. I thought, well, I wonder what Martin Luther King. He had this talk, this speech that he gave. I've been to the mountain. And so I Googled it, and I didn't realize how long a speech it was, but it's a wonderful speech. He gave it on April 13, 1968, the day before he was shot. And he's in Memphis to give a speech. He gave a speech to the people, and they were the next day going to march for the sanitation workers because they weren't getting the salary that they deserved. Anyway, in the speech, Martin Luther King said something that I had never remembered or heard, and he said that in 1960 he had gotten knifed. He was signing his first book in some public place, and some what he called a demented black woman stabbed him with a knife repeatedly, and then left the knife in his chest, and he collapsed to the ground. And he was rushed to the hospital with the blade still in his chest. And when the x-ray was taken, it was seen that the blade was just on the aorta. And the next day, the New York Times reported this incident, this happening, and said, had Dr. King sneezed, he would have cut his aorta, and he would have drowned in his blood. And then King said, about 4 days after that, I got everything went fine. And I was still in the hospital, and I was getting all these cards and telegrams, and then this is what he says. He says, and I got a telegram from the President of the United States, and I don't remember what he said. And I got a telegram from the Vice President. I don't remember what he said. And I got a letter from the Governor of New York, and I don't remember what he said. But I got this letter from this young girl, and I've never forgotten her letter. And then this is what the letter said. Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at White Plains, Georgia, high school. And then she said, while it should not matter, I would like to mention that I am a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I am simply writing you to say that I am so happy that you did not sneeze. And Martin Luther King said, and I am happy that I didn't sneeze, because it gave me an opportunity to see young black men sitting at counters protesting segregation. And it gave me the opportunity to march with my people and to demand freedom. And it gives me the opportunity to be here in Memphis. And he says, I don't know what men will do to me, and I don't care. I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the glory. I know what's coming. And I am all right. The opportunity that you and I have to make the most of the time. Because the days are evil. You see, it struck me as I was thinking about this passage, Paul has both a positive reason to be careful, namely, we have this new identity that we ought not to taint or tarnish or lose, so be careful with that. But there's also a more negative side to it, because the days are evil, so you have to be careful. And you say, well, what kind of evil is he talking about? COVID? I don't think so. He's talking moral evil, spiritual evil. In fact, if you go to the next chapter, which is just around the corner, you know that Paul talks about the fact that you and I are in conflict with the principalities and powers of darkness. And that we ought to suit up and not be mortally wounded by these anti-God forces that are in our world. And then I remembered that what's his name? Peter, the Apostle Peter. He talks about an adversary. We have an adversary, and he says this adversary is like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And I thought, I don't think if today we were to come up with an image of the evil powers, the ungodly powers, I don't think we'd make it a roaring lion. That's too obvious. I think the enemy is more like a virus. It's in the air. You breathe it. Flannery O'Connor says, we have been breathing atheism for the last 2 centuries. She said, reality over these last 2 centuries has grown thinner and thinner and thinner, so that reality is very much at the surface of things. There's no sense at all that we are grounded in God, or that we have our being supported by the Spirit of God. We are organisms in a little flat surface. This adversary, this virus, we live in a society that this is an observation that Nick Wollastorf taught me about, how religion is an interpretation of reality. This is how we understand reality. This is how we interpret it. And our society in which you and I live, they think that religion is just an add-on, a couple of add-ons. And if you scrape that off or slice it off, then we're both settled with the same things. And it's simply not true. The fact that the glory of God shines through everything changes everything. It just makes you and me, you're human beings, you're the image bearers of God. When Esau or Jacob met his brother, this is in the Old Testament, when Esau comes down and to meet Jacob, and Jacob sees that he means to be friends, Jacob exclaims, "In his face I saw the face of God." This world is dangerous, and it's dangerous in so many ways because it's so blasted indifferent to what we think so important. It's the indifference of it. Just one on that. Well, I don't have it here. Let me just see it. Stutter Kennedy. He was a preacher, theologian. He was a pastor during the First World War, and then he has a poem that he wrote called "When Christ Comes to Birmingham." He was an Englishman, obviously. Stutter Kennedy was. When Christ comes to Birmingham, and then he says that when he came to Calvary, men nailed him to a cross. But then he says this, when he came to Birmingham, they just passed him by. They would not hurt a hair of him. They only let him die. For men had grown more tender, and they were not going to give him pain. They only just passed down the street and left him in the rain. And still Jesus cried, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And still it rained the winter rain that drenched him through and through. The crowds went home and left the streets without a soul to see. And Jesus crouched against the wall and cried for Calvary. Indifference. Be careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of the time, because the days are evil. And then he goes on to say that we are to be filled with the Spirit. He has a number of things. Be filled with the Spirit, sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, and we should be in giving thanks and be subject to one another, serve one another. But I want us to just stop with this thought about being filled with the Spirit and not drunk on wine, which only leads to debauchery. Now, since he makes that tie-in with wine and being filled with the Spirit, it seems to me that being filled with the Spirit could be understood as being under the influence of. But like a person who drinks too much becomes is under the influence, we say, under the influence. He's not acting properly because he's under the influence. We're to be under the influence. We're to be filled with the Spirit. And you say to yourself, I wonder what that looks like. How do we get to be filled with the Spirit? And my thought is there's no other way than to keep in mind and before our minds and in our hearts Jesus Christ and the Spirit of Christ. And if you think of the Spirit as an incredibly benevolent force that brings Christ into our lives and strengthens us for faithful living, see, then we will be picked up and declare ourselves as Christians in the world. When we lose our connection with Christ, when we do not daily remind ourselves and open ourselves to the Christ, but my fear is that we will lose the vision. And with the vision, we will lose the mission. And we will become indifferent to this holy calling of being the beloved children of God, friends of Jesus Christ. So the word from this text is really this: be careful out there and go with God. Be careful and go with God. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.